They are desperate to continue the war in Ukraine. They're absolutely desperate to continue that war. And as Friedrich Merz gave a speech this week in which he sent a message to the Russians and sent a message to Donald Trump. And the message to the Russian was, we will not give up. Business as usual, we definitely want this war to continue. There's still some Ukrainians that can be sacrificed. And until we run out of Ukrainians, we want the war to go on. And they want to deliver them the Taurus missiles to strike against Russia and so forth. So they're all in, and they're not giving up. And I think that Merz is speaking on behalf of the European money-lending oligarchies. He doesn't speak for the German people. He's speaking for the same people that manage Emmanuel, that are the patrons to Emmanuel Macron and Keir Starmer and Mark Rutte. But the second message from Friedrich Merz is to Donald Trump, stay with us, the Europeans, blah, blah, blah. So he's trying to make it look like we are the cool kids club. And they are very desperate to bring the United States back into the fold and for the United States to pay for the war and to supply weapons for the war and preferably to supply troops as well for the war. With more demands, they're not going to say, if you agree to all this, then we're best friends forever. We can lift all the sanctions. We can be friends and allies. We're going to be investing in your country. You're going to be getting all kinds of capital for development and so on. It never happens that way. They always come back with more demands. And they've done whatever crisis you analyze through history, it's always the same. In 1938, the crisis between Germany and Czechoslovakia over the Sudeten region in the west of Czechoslovakia, it was the same. The Chamberlain government pressured Hitler into making all these extreme demands on the Edvard Beneš government in Prague. And then they pressured Beneš in Prague to concede everything. And then he says, okay, we don't want war. We concede everything. Then they go to Hitler and they say, we got all the concessions, but don't accept. You ask them this and this. And then they pile in things that they know is unacceptable to the other side. Because once you've weakened them to the maximum, then you still want to regime change. You still want to go to war. And this is always the same exact template. Now, one thing, if you understand where the fault lines are, how they're laid out, and what the war is actually about. And I always go back to that same George Soros thing. It's about, and so to try to cater to these ambitions of Turkic leaders like Erdogan and Aliyev in Azerbaijan is a way to bribe them into coming to your side. And then they say, hey, you could make all this happen, but we have to sabotage the Chinese-Russian project. We have to derail their development objectives, and then we'll create this greater Turania, and you're going to be the big sultans and rulers of this massive, very wealthy political entity. And this is very typical British. They always make promises, and they always try to appeal to their target proxies by giving them something that they might be secretly dreaming about. And they say, hey, we'll make it happen. We'll help you make this happen. And you're going to help us by regime changing Iran, by weakening Russia, by supporting Ukraine, by derailing this north-south, by partitioning Iran, maybe breaking off Tehran from the Caspian coast and so on. So this is where this is all coming from. But this is clear enough, but I have a suspicion that this is not a particularly strong card to play, because if it were a strong card, they wouldn't wait for the moment of absolute desperation to play that card, because the derailing of the Eurasian integrations and Russia and the Belt and Road Initiative was supposed to happen by imposing a proxy war through Ukraine on Russia. It's a war between two systems of governance. You understand that the war is existential for Russia, but it's also existential for Iran and for China, because if the West managed to regime change Russia, then in the very same way that they have used Ukraine as a proxy against Russia, then they would weaponize Russia as a proxy against China. And so once you understand that, then you know that their mutual support is not transactional, that you cannot bribe the Chinese away from supporting Russia, and you cannot bribe the Russians out of supporting Iran and China. And so we got proof of that because last week the Chinese said there is no way that they will cease supporting Russia in their effort in Ukraine. And this is the reason, because it really is existential, and this really is the war for humanity between the Western Empire, which is the whatever reincarnation of the British Empire that we're looking at, and pretty much the whole rest of humanity, and that includes us in the West. Because if they manage to reach their goal of global domination, let's say they eliminated all the rivals, they regime changed Russia, their regime changed Iran, their regime changed China, then their next target would be us. And they already told us what they think we should be, hackable animals, that we should be their worker ants. I know that they understand. There's been enough statements to that effect that the people in the Trump administration know fully well that the war in Ukraine is over for all practical purposes and that the Ukrainians lost. So that's a lost cause. No need to throw more resources into trying to reverse something that's already finished. So I think that from Trump's point of view is he's also getting these pressures at home to support Ukraine, to turn hostile against Russia, to impose bone-crushing sanctions and so forth. And rather than taking these pressures head on and to say, no, I will not do that, I will start nice and friendly relationship with Russia, he basically turns around and says, fine, okay, the Europeans want to go to war, they want to wage war against Russia still in Ukraine, fine. We'll provide them weapons, but you have to pay for them. And so he turns it into a business deal that's very favorable to the United States and very unfavorable to the Europeans. So he's, in a way, he's helping to financially weaken Europe. And so if they want to do that, fine, here you go. You give them the rope that they need to hang themselves with, and that's what they're going to end up doing in the end. They were not asking for the Donbas at all. So except for Crimea, Ukraine would have remained, their territorial integrity would have remained unchallenged. Of course, then we know that Boris Johnson flew over to Kiev and said, don't negotiate any peace. We're behind you. You're going to win this. We're going to take down Russia, fight it out on the battlefield. And then we see where we are now. But I believe that this is simply the Russian approach to waging war because they have to be able to show the international community, their own people, and the Ukrainians that they have done everything to avoid the war and to limit the damage from the conflict. Because after the war, there's going to have to be a political solution to the conflict. And the Ukrainian people will be keen to understand the history of how that war happened. And in order for them to become, again, in the future, a friendly neighboring nation, they have to see that the Russians didn't come to slaughter civilian population for no good reason, just out of a bloodthirsty revenge, but that they tried everything to find a political solution and limit the damage and the destruction and the casualties. So this is where I think the Russian inclination to always come to the negotiating table comes from. On the other side of the Atlantic, the United States, I think that they understand. No, I don't think. But elsewhere, there might be moving things around. There might be keen for there not to be any video footage of events because they're preparing something and they're desperate enough to be offering a nuclear weapon to the most corrupt regime in the world, which is at war. This is reckless beyond belief, but they're saying that they want to do it and they're doing it. There's no way that they will leave Odessa in the hands of Ukrainians. And I have to qualify this because it's not 100% certain that the Russians are going to liberate Odessa by military means, because I don't think that they have to. What Russia has to achieve is for the government in Kiev to realign with Moscow. That's what they need to achieve. If that happens, then there's no need to militarily liberate Odessa. because for all practical purposes, at that point, Russia already controls Odessa. So I think that's going to be the battle for the transition of Ukrainian government, so that from a Western-aligned government, it becomes a Moscow-aligned government. And so I think that this is going to be part of the peace negotiations, part of the armistice, which I don't think is going to happen, because it seems to me that Trump understands the game, and that whether he's being stupid or stupid like a fox, or I think that he is stirring the ship in the right direction. And there was also a speech by Tulsi Gabbard recently in which she said that there are very strong pressures being exerted on the administration every single day to derail the relationship between the United States and Russia, and to bring back the United States into the fold of the Western colonial powers. It seems to me that the Russians are consistently offering negotiations in good faith, because if you offer a deal at a negotiating table, even if it's a very tough deal, you come there with ready to negotiate, ready to sign a peace agreement, an armistice. You set your conditions. If you do that, and the other side says, no, we will not accept these terms, then you are justified in continuing the war. Like, you have a moral and also a legal justification for continuing to pursue your ends through military means, because the other side rejected the diplomatic means. So I think that the Russians have done that since the very beginning of the war. On the fourth day of the special military operations, the Russians already reached out to Kiev to offer a negotiated settlement. And at that stage, they were only asking to keep Crimea. And because this has been the role of the United States in the whole post-World War II order, to wage wars on behalf of the Western Empire, pay for it, arm them, and provide troops. And this is what the United States has been doing. And I think that Trump is tired of that relationship. I didn't really get to the bottom of what the deal is with the weapons, but it seems to me that Trump said, okay, we're going to supply all these weapons for the United States. But it's not like before under Biden, where they just ship the weapons to the Ukrainians and that's done. Now Trump wants the Ukrainians to pay for these weapons. And the Europeans, he wants Ukrainians to buy the weapons, so they're not being gifted. And the Ukrainians are going to pay for it the Ukrainians are going to buy the weapons, but the Europeans are going to pay for them. And I think that the terms that he imposed on these transfers are such that I think there's already about 10 NATO members countries who said, we're not interested, we're not doing this, we're not paying for these weapons. So it seems to me that the whole Trump pivot wasn't really a pivot against Russia and in favor of the Ukrainians, that the pivot was, okay, you are desperate to continue this war, fine, you're going to have to pay for it now. So I'll deliver the weapons to your Volodymyr Zelensky, but it's going to come at a cost that you're going to pay. And I also more and more strongly believe that Trump understands what the game is and that he's on the right side of history, because somebody who is in the know, it was Susan Kokinda of the Promethean Action Committee, who is very politically active, but she told me that in a recent cabinet meeting about all these Middle Eastern events in Washington, that Trump on several occasions during the meeting made a point of calling America's enemies, Iran, Russia, China. He said, our enemies. And he also called them the people that are perceived to be our enemies. That's a very strange way to formulate, what you mean to say. But it's very clear that he's not buying that Iran is an enemy to the United States, that Russia is an enemy to the United States, that China is an enemy. He understands who the real enemy is. And so that's all bad news for the undead British Empire, because now they have very powerful constellation of regional powers arrayed against them, and they know what the game is. And the whole British thing depends on people with very thin hold on power. UAE is important as a new, let's say, new Middle Eastern financial center. Qatar is important as a new, let's call it, intelligence special forces headquarters for the Western Empire. Damascus is now important, but what? Damascus is ruled by a foreigner imposed by the Turks and the British. The war on farmers, the elimination of natural foods in favor of crickets and grasshoppers and stuff, and so forth. This is who we're dealing with, and this is who Russia, China, and Iran are opposed to. And I increasingly believe that Trump is also opposed to them, that he's not a, let's say, a co-opted, sold-out ally of this center of power, but that he's actually the enemy to them. With your money, and we are going to deliver them when we can and when we have them. So it was like a very crappy deal for the Europeans and for Ukraine, but it did allow the public relations side of things to turning into some kind of a victory of Trump turning against Putin. And Trump, like the Financial Times ran a story in which they deviously slipped in that Trump was encouraging Volodymyr Zelensky to strike at Moscow and at St. Petersburg, which the White House denied. And Trump himself said, no, I don't think he should be striking at Moscow at all. And then the BBC also tried to slip in this leak that Trump said something like that he's done with Vladimir Putin, that no more Mr. Nice Guy. And then Trump denied that. This is all psyops to try to derail the relationship between the United States and Russia, and to try to force Trump back into the fold of the Western powers, ultimately with the goal of maneuvering him into providing a security guarantee to the Kiev government. And they made it easy for even foreign countries and foreign companies to set up R&D centers in China. If you make it easy and cheap for me to conduct research and development in China, then I might do that. And then, you know what China gets out of it, that you bring some of the top brains from the West into China, where they then can work with them and they can even poach them. They can tell them like, hey, if you come to work for Xiaomi, then you're going to get a better salary, bigger bonus, whatever. And so they've been able to poach top talent from Western corporations and Western nations to their own side. And at the same time, the West has been mired in spending substantially all of their money on wars and bombs and missiles and military aircraft and military bases everywhere around the world. So obviously, China is going to be running circles. I think this is crystal clear to Trump and to the people around him. People who get it are like people like J.D. Vance and Scott Bessent and Peter Navarro. And they are dead serious about turning the ship around and starting to catch up with China. And this is part of the big, beautiful bill that many people don't understand because they're just focused on this fiscal, fiscal conservatism angle. And it's also an integral part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So it's also in that sense extremely important to China. And it also connects India to the northwest, to the northeast of Europe and the northwest of Russia. And so for everybody but the Western Empire, this is very important. Now, whoever understands this understands it. They don't need additional evidence in the form of Israeli bombs and American bombs. But you always have a segment, a part of the political class, who would like to realign the nation with the West nonetheless, because they'd like to send their children to Oxford and to Harvard, and they maybe have bank accounts in the West, and they would like to buy a house in London or already have it, or they're connected with the MEK somehow. And they can always argue, if we aligned with the West, then they would lift sanction and we could develop our economy and we could be at peace and blah, blah, blah. And then, like, when these bombs fall, then, you understand that making friendly overtures to the West is very foolish. They will stab you in the back all the same, even if you give them all the concessions. Because when you make all the concessions that they ask for, then they're going to say, okay, hold on 1 minute, let's see about that. And then they're going to come, they lost that one. And so now the British have signed a military cooperation agreement with Azerbaijan. they sent recently a military attaché to Baku for the first time ever. And then I think it was last month or in May, they signed a military cooperation agreement with Kazakhstan. Why does Kazakhstan need to have a military cooperation agreement with the British? I don't understand, but I know why British might like to start to developing their intelligence network among the security services of Kazakhstan, because they're going to be running out of the last Ukrainians. If they resolve the electromagnetic radiation inside the car, I might even get interested in an electric car at that stage. If you keep parties at war nonstop, and you're the one with the monopoly on financial capital and on credit, you have the global monopoly on advanced high-tech weaponry and other types of technology for communications, for oil drilling, pipelines, all the technologies that are necessary for industrial development and production of energy and transport and so on. Then if you keep everybody at war against the other, you keep them from developing, but you also make them dependent on you for money, because once you go to war, first thing you need is going to be credit. And then immediately you're going to have to spend a lot of that credit, if not all of it, on weaponry, which again, you're going to be buying from BAE Systems and so forth, which are one of the major arms merchants in the Middle East. So this divide and conquer, constant flaming of the war escalations is coming ultimately from London and then also from Paris. And we still have their military and naval presence of French ships, American ships, British ships. But the difference now is that Trump is trying to extricate the United States from that region. And I know that it doesn't seem that way, because a lot of people are interpreting Trump's action quite as the opposite. But the more I'm observing events and politics in the United States itself, the more I'm convinced. And so long as the Ukrainians are refusing and will continue to be supported by the West and be aligned with the West, then maybe if the Ukrainian defenses grow so weak that it becomes easy for the Russians to take Odessa without destroying the city itself, then they might try to take it over militarily or to surround it and blockade it and force the other side to lay down their arms. But I think that the cheaper and easier and more elegant way of taking control would be in an administrative process. So the support that Trump gave them came at such unfavorable terms that it's going to end up being very unattractive. And some of them are moaning about the 50-day time limit, where he said, oh, I'm going to impose all these costs on Russia if they don't come to the table within 50 days. I don't know how he came up with that 50 days number, but I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't reached in some kind of a back channel communication with the Russians themselves. And we can see that the Russians have now sharply increased the intensity of their attacks on Ukraine. So maybe there will be an offensive towards the end of the summer where they will just sweep to who knows where, maybe to the east bank of the Dnieper River. We'll find out, but something is coming up. Something is coming up, and it has panicked the West enough that the British are now, I think they're already doing it. They're trying to transfer a nuclear weapon to the Ukrainians. So this is the big danger. When there was recently the Odessa Security Forum held in Odessa, and there was a British general there. Maybe he wasn't a general, maybe lieutenant colonel, forget his name. But he was saying, yes, I think that the United Kingdom should help Ukraine obtain a nuclear weapon. He wasn't just thinking about that. They're already doing it.